on a journey toward a freer world through sound economic policy and a love for individual freedom. Welcome to Free the World.
Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Free the World, a show from Students for Liberty where we explore the truths, the ideas that set us free. I'm your host, Josh Eakle, the Global Marketing Director here at Students for Liberty. And today we're going to talk about something that's top of mind for a lot of people, especially in the context of this current political campaign season that we're about to enter, specifically related to the global economy, globalization, the impacts on trade, security, and policy. Today we're going to talk to somebody from the from Cato's Herbert Seifel Center for Trade Policy Studies. His name is Scott Lincicome. He's the Director of General Economics at Cato there, and he also writes on international and domestic economic issues, including international trade, subsidies and industrial policy, manufacturing and global supply chains, and economic dynamism. So we're going to bring him on here to discuss this kind of topic and dig into the details. So good morning or good afternoon, Scott. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me frame the conversation a bit, and then we can get a little bit into the weeds and talk about some of the nuance. So obviously, there's a lot of people right now talking about globalization. There's a lot of people in the news, in our political environment, talking about the individuals that are left behind, the trade implications, the security implications. Right. It's a centric conversation to the political system nowadays. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was the tensions between economic openness, so, a free trade right. in this globalized economy, and national interests. This is playing out in the context of things like, I can think about TikTok or steel tariffs, things like that. And the role of government in fostering or hindering innovation and competitiveness. And then also tie it back towards its impact on like populist movements and kind of how populism is playing a role in effectively pushing back in many cases against what has been the established economic order for the last 100 years or so. So maybe I could kick us off real quick, Scott, with a question that centers around inequality. So as you know, the criticism of globalization centers around certain groups getting legs up over others and some groups being left behind. Yeah. And, I want to know maybe a little bit about what you feel like from a policy perspective, from maybe a trade policy perspective, what policy measures could address these types of disparities while not impacting economic growth. Really big picture question, just kind of tee you off on the current conversation happening in politics.
Yeah, sure. The common narrative, like you said, is that trade somehow boosts inequality. But the folks that have actually examined this have found really almost no linkage between having a more open economy and having more or less inequality. And that's for a whole host of reasons. The first one is, and as a trade guy, I shouldn't be saying this, but it's true, is that trade is one of many drivers of economic disruption and growth and the rest. It's oftentimes blamed for anything and everything. But in reality, particularly in a place like the United States, which, believe it or not, is a relatively closed economy in the sense that our trade as a share of our gross domestic product is actually pretty small relative to a lot of other countries. And so, in the United States, trade plays a pretty small role in all of this. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is that people tend to think of globalization, at least in politics, they tend to think of trade and globalization only from the producer perspective, and only from producers that make and export stuff. So, you hear stats about the trade deficit and about import competition killing jobs and the rest. But the reality is that there's a lot more to trade than just producing and exporting. Importing is really great for American consumers. It helps you and me and families in particular stretch their budgets. So we have more variety, cheaper stuff. And that means higher real incomes. So incomes adjusted for cost of living. And that's actually disproportionately good for poorer people. So trade is pro-poor on the consumption side, and that might sound weird, but it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because we all have to basically consume the same stuff: food, clothing, shelter, and the rest. But wealthy people have a lot more left over after we spend on those necessities for stuff that isn't really traded. Maybe we go get a massage or something like that, or we have higher mortgage payments and the rest. Now, that stuff is not tradable. It's just not related to the global economy much at all. Whereas all those necessities, food, clothing, construction materials, shoes, that kind of stuff is, and trade lowers those prices. So study after study shows that on the consumption side, poor people benefit disproportionately. So they benefit way more than rich people when it comes to that. So when you add those things together, it really, I think, provides a much fuller context to how trade affects the economy and inequality in particular. And again, that's why generally it's basically a wash. There's just not much evidence of trade fueling widespread inequality anywhere in the world, and particularly in the United States.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the impact of what free trade over the last 80 or so years, we've seen a massive decline in extreme poverty, which all makes sense. And one of the things that I would like to maybe play devil's advocate onto that argument and ask you kind of where the narrative that I hear, especially from populists, and heck, I mean, I hear this narrative from almost every side of the political spectrum today, is that sure, goods are cheaper, right? We've got cheaper products, maybe more diverse products, but by exporting or relying on a lot of imports, you're removing the jobs domestically.
Right.
There's less of that happening.
Yeah.
So I am curious as to how you address that narrative.
Sure.
I mean, I want to get into some of the stuff that Biden talked about with tariffs, because there's obviously almost even a 180 policy from where he was at in 2019. But I'm just curious as to how you kind of respond to that argument.
Well, sure. The first one is to, again, go back to the fact that the vast majority of us work in services, and most of those services have very little connection to the global economy. Only about 10% of the workforce is in manufacturing. Manufacturing is mainly where you see tradable goods and trade and competition and foreign competition. There's some in services, but mainly not. So the vast majority of us are basically just winning on the consumption side and not facing any of that import competition stuff. But even in manufacturing, the reality is that about half of everything we import is stuff used by manufacturers in the United States to make other stuff. It's raw materials and equipment and the rest. And that actually boosts jobs in those manufacturing sectors. So there's a lot of manufacturers that, because of those imports, and then because of new export markets, actually increase employment, have more jobs and better paying jobs, the studies show, because of trade, right? The second big issue, though, is that protectionism, so that's the opposite of free trade, has repeatedly been found not to actually really help protect and save jobs in the long term. I mean, sure, you get a bit of a sugar high in the short term, but first, when you apply a tariff on steel, for example, like President Trump did, well, you're hurting those downstream manufacturers. They're going to buy less steel in the long term because they have higher costs. So that's going to reduce actually demand for your products in the steel industry. But the second thing is that over time, protected companies get slow and lazy. They invest more in lobbying for protection and subsidies than they do in innovation. And in case after case after case, whether it's the bicycle industry or the footwear industry or shipbuilding or steel or whatever, traditionally protected industries in the United States end up hemorrhaging jobs anyway, going out of business anyway, even though they've had protection, or they just always end up running back to the government for even more protection. So they're basically on the permanent dole. So this idea that we can just save everybody's job, that we can have this wonderfully protected economy with no economic disruption from trade, really doesn't hold any water. And then, of course, the other big thing is that trade is just another form of economic disruption. It's like technology. It's like changing consumer tastes. And all of that disruption is really good. That churn, that dynamism in the economy is good for the long-term trajectory of the economy. It not only means more growth, but it means more innovation. It means higher wages over time. So if you look at the median worker's wage since peak globalization in the 1990s, it's up about 40% or so, adjusting for inflation. So that means basically the median American worker has been getting about a 1% raise every year since the 1990s. Now, 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot over time, again, because you're accounting for changing living costs. So that's a good thing. And so when you look at trade, you have to consider it as part of the big disruption basket. Trade, whether it's with the guy across the street or the guy in another state or in another country, all of that is the type of disruption, the same as having robots or computers or people who decide to buy fewer goods and more services. All of that disruption is kind of the price of admission to a dynamic and prosperous economy. And we always have to consider that when we talk about saving a few jobs or sticking the economy in some sort of, nostalgic 1950s paradigm. The fact is that make us poorer in the long term.
Okay, well, at the time of this recording, Biden has come out and announced a whole new round of tariffs, I believe, against Chinese EVs. And I thought this was just such an interesting change of heart that it can be characterized by some of his public statements on the matter. And I wanted to just talk a bit about tariffs briefly, and then go a little bit maybe into more of some of the national security stuff. But Biden in 2019 said Trump doesn't get the basics. He thinks tariffs are being paid by China. Any freshman econ student can tell you that the American people are paying his tariffs. The cashiers at Target see what's going on. They know more about economics than Trump. That was 2019. And then again, at the time of this recording, I think this was 2 days ago, this is Biden again, I just imposed a series of tariffs on goods made in China, 25% on steel and aluminum, 50% on semiconductors, 100% on EVs, 50% on solar panels. China is determined to dominate these industries, and I'm determined to ensure America leads the world in them. Yeah. So obviously 180, I want to center a little bit about just tariffs in general and their effectiveness, and then talk a little bit about maybe some of the national security stuff.
Sure.
But do you feel like this policy is going to, I guess you've maybe already answered this question. Maybe you can add some more context specifically to this new round of tariffs. Do you feel like this is going to have any positive outcome in any way? And how do tariffs move their way through the economy? Who really ends up paying those things? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around that.
Yeah. So 2019 Biden had the best of that argument compared to 2024 Biden. Hilariously, President Biden's United States Trade Representative Catherine Tai spoke out of turn yesterday or 2 days ago and said that tariffs don't raise prices, and has since had to walk that back. Since not only did every economist worth his salt speak up and go, yes, they do, because if they didn't raise prices, they wouldn't protect any companies or jobs or whatever. The whole point is to raise prices. But beyond that, they, of course, have contradicted by Biden just 5 years ago. So it's pretty funny to watch her have to walk that back. Just today, CNN reported that USTRs misspoke. That's the official line. But, more broadly, the fact is that this is a classic example of how tariffs are political instruments far more than economic ones. And how politics rots your brain, quite frankly. The fact is that, as I and many other people have written, American tariff history is replete with examples of corruption and cronyism. In fact, one of the reasons why the president today has so much power over tariff policy, which is actually vested in the Congress under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. The reason Congress has delegated so much power to the president over the last century is because in the 19th century, tariff policy was set by Congress, and it was among the most corrupt practices, the legislating of tariffs, in the history of the United States. I mean, there are truly toe-curling episodes of just straight-up payoffs using tariff policy as funneled through the Congress. So that political tradition continues today, quite frankly. President Trump's tariffs had these exclusion processes, so you could apply for an exclusion. You could get yourself a lobbyist and go and run to Washington and beg for an exclusion from the tariffs. And multiple independent government reports have shown that the whole thing was just rife with cronyism. The steel tariffs were basically being determined, the exemptions were being determined by the steel industry, which is, like an occupational licensing system where the cartel gets to decide if you get in, right? So there's that type of political those types of politics in trade is a constant thing in tariff policy. And in terms of President Biden, the calculus is pretty simple. The tariffs are meant to primarily be a symbol. The fact is that we already have tariffs on most of the stuff that Biden just tariffed again. Chinese imports of steel and semiconductors and EVs are really low already because of those pre-existing tariffs and because Americans really don't want to buy Chinese EVs that much. And so it's more symbolic, at least in the short term, than anything. But the president is trying to win an election, and the president is convinced, his team is convinced that to win the White House again, he has to win certain votes in the industrial Midwest, particularly auto workers and steel workers and certain unions. And this is a show of support, and that he's out there, protecting their jobs and their livelihoods and the rest. Even though, again, it's mostly political theater. Now, in the long term, though, there are reasons to be concerned about this, because 100% tariff on electric vehicles is effectively a ban, right? 25% you might get around. By the time you get to 100, you're basically put up a giant wall. And we have tons of history and economic literature to show that by severely restricting or even banning foreign goods from the US market, particularly lower priced goods, because Chinese EVs tend to be some of the lowest priced in the world. Well, what does that do? Well, it doesn't raise the price of Chinese EVs here because there are none, but it does raise the price of American-made SUV or EVs, Korean EVs that are made in the U.S. market, even imports from others, like say the Europeans. And how do we know this? Well, about 40 years ago, the Reagan administration imposed a bunch of quotas, really hard restrictions on Japanese vehicles, which at the time were more fuel efficient and lower priced, very similar to Chinese EVs today. And what happened? Well, American car prices increased. European car prices increased. Of course, Japanese car prices increased to the extent they were let in. And the hit to the U.S. economy and to American consumers was about, in today's dollars, about $17 billion a year in net economic losses because of those restrictions. So we could expect in the long term similar harms because, again, China is a low price provider of those things and solar panels and a few other things on the list.
Very insightful. Interesting. So let's talk, because I do want to get into the political side, because you touched on that a little bit with Biden trying to use these to win an election. We'll talk about populism in a minute, but I do want to lean a little bit into the national security conversation. So, this is a compelling argument. I think it's one of the arguments that I think anyone that's an advocate for free trade really has to figure out a way to address is, this concept of national security. Like, should we be, and I think that a lot of people are having this conversation after COVID-19 in the last couple of years. Should we be, I mean, to your point, free trade enriches everyone, right? Should we be trading with foreign adversaries and enriching them? There's there's an element of talking about it from the perspective of, if we're making China more wealthy and they're building better weapons and then they could turn into a conflict in the future, is that valuable? There's also the conversation that you touched on a second ago around, well, China is subsidizing their steel production, and by the nature of it, U.S. manufacturers can't compete, which reduces domestic production, which then is a national security could be a national security crisis in time of war. And I remember Milton Friedman had this whole conversation in like the 90s when Japan they're having a similar conversation around Japanese steel and all this. So I am curious as to Japan not being an adversary, but the same conversation seems to repeat itself. I am curious a bit about how you address the national security side of this. And how do you feel like free trade plays a role in addressing those concerns?
Yeah, although just a little fun note about the Japan thing you mentioned. In the 1980s, a lot of people actually did consider Japan an adversary.
Oh, okay. Noted.
There actually were books about the coming war with Japan. So Japan is obviously fundamentally different from China, given the government and other things. But we really shouldn't lose track of the fact that Japan hysteria in the 1980s and 1990s was not merely economic. I mean, there was some really crazy stuff said back then by protectionists and isolationists back then. And we, of course, laugh at that today, but we shouldn't lose sight of that because I do think it helps with a little bit of context. Now, going to China. I think it's really important before we get into some of the weeds to start with a fundamental error that I think a lot of people make when we talk about trade and national security. And that is that the United States as a thing does not trade with China as a thing. Trade, even with a state-directed economy like China, is the vast majority of that trade is between individuals at companies and whatever. I trade with a person in China, and we do that voluntarily. We do that for mutual benefit. So when we talk about national security, there's this. It's oftentimes the case made in terms of the national interest or that the government is doing that. It's not the case. So we, in terms of, especially as a libertarian, we have to remember that when you talk about protectionism on national security grounds, we have to acknowledge that that is really the government getting in the way of those voluntary human individual transactions. So we need to start with that. We should, and thus we should have a presumption to allow those transactions to occur. Now, even libertarians, even Milton Friedman, even me, have made a clear exception for national security, that there is a role for the government to interfere in those voluntary transactions where there are legitimate national security reasons to do so. But the key is legitimate. And there's a lot of reasons to think that some of the crazier China-related protectionism you hear out there has absolutely nothing to do with legitimate national security concerns. And I should note, by the way, not just related to China. The fact is that just like any other form of rent seeking, the term national security is thrown around all the time, but oftentimes it's baseless. We'll go back to President Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs. They were imposed on national security grounds, even though the Department of Defense said, yeah, we don't need tariffs, that the steel industry makes a ton of steel. We only need about 1% to 3%, we being the Department of Defense. And we are totally not worried about imports coming from close allies like Canada or Japan or Europe. And what did we get? Well, in a room full of the steelworkers union and steel bosses, President Trump slapped tariffs, national security tariffs on imports of steel from all over the world. And not just fancy steel or steel we need for aircraft carriers and tanks, but all types of steel, including things like rebar and really junky, low-grade, low-quality steel that doesn't really matter for national security. So this and the China tariffs ended up doing a lot of the same stuff. First of all, they weren't even imposed on national security grounds. That was intellectual property concerns. But second, they ended up being expanded into goods that have absolutely nothing to do with national security, like children's clothing or women's breast pumps. There's laundry lists of examples of stuff that is not, we're not trying to lead the future in. They're not high tech. They're nothing. They're just really kind of low cost goods that again benefit the people who are buying them, and thus have no reason to be blocked by the government. So, we need to remain really, really skeptical about these invocations of national security, acknowledging that there are going to be narrow exceptions, but they need to remain narrow. And unfortunately, politics does what it does, and it turns narrow exceptions into giant, broad rules and making the rest of us poorer in the process. But there are two other, I think, really big things in the NatSec context. The first is that there's a lot of literature out there that shows that nations that trade with each other, and I'm breaking my own rule because it's really people in nations that trade with each other, but those nations tend not to go to war with each other. That trade tends to. It doesn't guarantee that there won't be a war, but it does tend to reduce armed conflict, and tends to reduce armed conflict pretty substantially, like say a 30% reduction in the risk of armed conflict. And this makes perfect sense, right? You don't want to bomb your customers, and you'll have business interests that will lobby against bombing their customers or suppliers. So a lot of trade that goes on can actually boost national security, to the extent we define national security as I do, as not getting attacked, not having your friends get attacked, and the rest. That is, again, trade can play a really good role in discouraging that type of bad stuff. And then when it comes to resiliency, well, here too, I think the pandemic has scrambled a lot of brains, because the fact is that if you actually look at the economics literature says, yes, global supply chains and trade among nations can make you a little more vulnerable to a shock if it occurs in a place like China or Japan, because, of course, you can't get the stuff that's coming from China or Japan. But those exact same studies show that the same risks apply to nationalized supply chains. So supply chains that are just totally domestic, totally here in the United States, because the shock can occur in the United States. So when we had a freak ice storm in Texas a few years ago, that shut down a national chemical supply chain. Semiconductor companies in the United States couldn't get their semiconductors, and that contributed to the semiconductor shortage. And then we had the ultimate example of this in the baby formula crisis. Well, about 98% of all baby formula consumed in the United States is made in the United States, thanks to these big trade barriers we have, big regulatory barriers. So when a single factory in Michigan went down because of a bacteria scare, what happened? The supply chain was broken for a year. It turned out to be one of the deepest and worst supply chain crises of the entire pandemic. And what did the government do to try to solve that crisis? Well, President Biden flew in baby formula from Germany on military planes. Congress suspended tariffs on baby formula so that we could have international supplies. So there are many examples of the fact that while some trade can occasionally make us less resilient, overall, having a big, open, dynamic economy and having trade with others can actually make us more resilient, can make supply chains stronger. It can make companies more able to adapt when bad things happen, and can make us richer, right? I mean, one of the things is being just a wealthy nation, having industrial capacity, which, we're the second largest manufacturing nation in the world. We have lots of industrial capacity. Having that in times of trouble, having a flexible economy can have us adapt and make short-term shocks just that, short-term.
Okay, well then I feel like you've made incredibly compelling cases from the national security side. Free trade is prosperity. It's resilience. It's even national security. It's good for national security. So let's take it back then to the critics. So there is a deeply rooted sentiment in American society right now that, as we talked about earlier, free trade has left behind all these groups. There's more skepticism around just globalization as a concept than I've ever seen in my adult life. And I'm sure there's historical allegories to this, but it's obviously reaching what I feel like is a peak point. So that is driven, that deep frustration and distress has driven these major, large populist movements, especially on the right, that are effectively pushing back against this. So I am curious as to just a broad commentary on what you feel like has led to some of these kind of populist movements. What do you think the outcomes will be? I mean, I can make some assumptions based on our conversation as to what, if we go full blown anti-free trade, where that's going to end up. But yeah, just a big picture question on kind of our political conversation now and how you, what you think's maybe contributed to it.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of things. It's certainly not monocausal. You have in the last 20 years or so, I think a perfect storm of events of sorts that has really driven this. The first is, as we've already discussed, the rise of China as an illiberal regime that, policymakers in the 90s, after decades of Chinese liberalization, were hoping that increased trade with China, opening China to the global economy, China joining the World Trade Organization, was going to eventually lead to a more liberal regime. And contra the haters, it actually looked like that was the case until about 2000, until basically the financial crisis. And then there's been a huge U-turn. Of course, Xi Jinping has really kind of ramped up the authoritarianism. And that, I think, along with the sheer size of China's economy, their export competitiveness, has caused some people to reconsider some of the things they thought. Now, I have to note there that liberalization of China's political system was never the primary goal of any of that stuff I mentioned. It was gravy. The main reasons the United States engaged with China was one, out of necessity. Every other country was. So American companies and investors were going to lose out. So that's very pragmatic, cold and calculating stuff. The other was that, letting China or keeping China out of the WTO was really just not an option. The United States didn't really have some sort of broad veto power over that. And so the goal was, look, we'll engage more with them with the hope that it will not just make us richer, not just make them richer, but maybe eventually liberalize too. So it didn't happen. But it certainly, that change in China, I think, has driven some of this, as well as of import competition. You've probably heard about the China shock. Well, people and economists disagree greatly about how much of the China shock was driven by those policy changes I mentioned, and about how much that actually hurt the economy. Most economists think on net we benefited, but the fact is that created disruption, and it created disruption in some politically important places in the industrial Midwest. And so that's also fueled some of the China-related protectionism that exists. The second big thing is the financial crisis. That had nothing to do with really trade and globalization, but the fact is that in retrospect, I think we realized that the Great Recession was much deeper and longer than we thought. And that fuels a lot of insecurity about jobs and growth and the rest. And trade is a natural scapegoat for economic insecurity issues. Even though, like I said, the United States is not trade is not that a huge part of the U.S. economy, even though there's tons of other things that are far more important. And especially when you look at, the financial crisis, it's mainly, financial things and housing and the rest. Doesn't matter. People blame trade. It's very natural. Blame foreigners. It's very, very natural. The third big one, let's face it, is Donald Trump. Trump has been a protectionist his entire life. Go back to the 1980s and you'll find op-eds from Donald Trump bashing Japan and saying we have a trade deficit with Japan and that's terrible and they're going to eat our lunch and we need tariffs and the rest. Today, it's much the same. So the guy is kind of a natural protectionist and is extremely influential on the right and in the Republican Party. And that is going to remove what was a decent check on protectionism, because Democrats have been pretty protectionist for a while, mainly because of union related connections, because unions are very protectionist. And so if Republicans start doing that stuff too, well, then Democrats have to, that's like Biden doing just the other day, right? And they're going to kind of up the ante, and you get this kind of protectionist race to the bottom. So Trump has definitely played, I think, a big role in this. And then the pandemic is the last one. Even though, like I said, studies show that globalized supply chains actually did better than nationalized ones during the pandemic, that doesn't matter. Psychologically, when you see empty store shelves, when you see container ships backed up at the port of Los Angeles, when you see these things, the natural inclination that the human brain thinks, bring it all home. Make it all locally, even though we don't do that in our own homes or in our own neighborhoods. It doesn't matter. Kind of the natural inclination is, if we had a nationalized supply chain, we wouldn't have these problems. Again, never mind the baby formula and the economic studies and the rest. So I think you put all that together, and it's really not that surprising that we're going through this protectionist moment. But even then, I'd note, if you look at the polls that are conducted on trade, and we at Cato actually have just gotten back new polling on this that we'll be publishing in a couple of months. Even then, people are not nearly as protectionist as I think the political narrative is, that you hear in Washington. Oh, there's this huge bottom-up groundswell of protectionism. We all have to be protectionists now. Fact is, when you ask people about their views on international trade, they're still relatively positive. If you use certain catchwords like globalization, then things go down. But when you ask them if trading with other nations and people in other nations, okay, they're actually mostly positive. When you ask them if they're really willing to pay a lot more for a pair of American-made blue jeans, they say no, they're not. So we've asked a lot of these types of questions. When you ask people about policy without assigning it to Trump or Biden, their answers change dramatically, showing that a lot of this is partisanship or culture related, sure, not economic. When you ask them how much they view trade as an important issue, that it's always at the bottom of the list, meaning they don't think or care much about it. So these types of things are really important for thinking about these issues. That, the rhetoric in Washington, in the media, is, everybody's a protectionist. But when you actually talk to normal humans, not people in Congress, the answers are far different.
Noted. Okay. Well, you also touched on something towards the end there that I kind of wanted to maybe on the takeout of the conversation here touch on before we left, which was the word globalization. One of the things that I find interesting about misconceptions online, and I see this all the time on Twitter nowadays, is this conflating of globalism and globalization. Yes. This idea that we all know, I think I'll probably butcher the definition, but to me, globalism is this idea of like global governance, whereas globalization is actually a very inherently libertarian or classically liberal idea. Yeah. That's about free trade between individuals and different nations. And it's just a natural consequence of the market, right? So I like to say libertarians are huge advocates of globalization, but because of this weird conflating that's done to these two terms, it seems, as you said, in polling, it probably reflects that people just have this really negative impact. So a lot of people tie globalization back to these international institutions like the WTO, the World Trade Organization, or the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. As somebody who's not an expert on how those two institutions regulate international trade, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about like how do they operate, and then how do you maybe tie that to like a libertarian worldview and
Sure.
and address that kind of weird confusion between the two terms?
Yeah, it's natural, I think, that people conflate the two things. And one of the reasons we launched this big globalization project at Cato is to remind everybody that humans have been trading across long distances since basically the dawn of recorded history. The earliest evidence of this is like 3000 BC, and that whether it's Adam Smith or Milton Friedman or anybody else, the fact is that we understand, we in the biz understand trade as an inherently human activity. Man is the animal that trades, right? That according to Adam Smith. And that the only thing that's really changed over the centuries is technology that has allowed us to trade a lot more, whether it's via computers or container ships or the internet or whatever. And the politics. The fact is that, starting in around, the 18th century or so, we had a lot of mercantilism and a lot of trade barriers. Then we started eliminating those trade barriers, and I mean political trade barriers, tariffs and quotas and bans and the rest. We started eliminating those and had this first big wave of globalization. Then we had a bunch of world wars that basically shut down this trade. So this, market exchange of goods and services and people and investment and the rest. And then over the last century, basically since the 1950s, we've been unwinding all of those government barriers again. Not all, but a lot of them, right? So that's what we believe we call globalization. It's just people exchanging stuff across long distances, distances that just so happen to have a political border in between them, right? That's the libertarian idea of globalization. But it's inevitably true that modern globalization has trade agreements as part of it. And the trade agreement, the big one that started in the 1940s and then was renovated in the 1990s, is the World Trade Organization. Now, the World Trade Organization is not a giant globalist organization. It's actually pretty small. It is entirely member driven, meaning member governments run the place, just make all the decisions. So they have to make them via consensus. But it's also true that those agreements that are in place have led to a pretty dramatic reduction in political barriers to trade over the years. But that's not really what we think of when we think of global government. That's not really the WTO. And it's certainly not things like NAFTA or other trade agreements. Now, we as libertarians, we don't really like those trade agreements, right? Because they're inevitably political. They're going to include not just tariff and other liberalization, but they're going to include some stuff we don't like all legislation does. So they'll include intellectual property issues. They'll include other restrictions that won't phase out all tariffs, all that kind of stuff. So, but that's a bit of, that's kind of the political price we pay to eliminate all those other pre-existing trade barriers. And the WTO is similar to that. Basically, it's a government-to-government agreement to get rid of as many barriers as possible in a politically palatable way, because unfortunately, politicians won't be unilaterally liberalizing as much as we wish they could. But that doesn't mean that our globalization project is pro-global government or globalism, like you said. In fact, we have an essay coming out in a few weeks that basically is a cosmopolitan case against global government. And so we're working to distinguish between efforts to have global regulations like the OECD tax rules that are very much not about eliminating barriers to commerce, enhancing economic freedom, but actually restricting economic freedom. Well, that's a far different from the type of globalization that is natural and that we're trying to promote.
All makes sense. And again, as a classical liberal libertarian, we know decentralization works, and when you allow individuals make the right, decisions best for them on who they trade with and who they interact with, it typically creates a more prosperous, healthy, and free world. But this has been an incredibly enlightening conversation for me, Scott. I mean, I knew some of these things kind of intuitively through my reading, but I feel like you did an amazing job of contextualizing this for our audience and really putting it in clear terms. So I really do you have anything that you might want to tell our audience about or plug, or tell them if they want to learn more, maybe read a book or go to a website? Anything top of mind for you?
Well, the biggest thing is to definitely go to our website at cato.org, Defending Globalization. That's the name of the project. And the project was really designed to become a one-stop shop for anything and everything you need when you want to learn about these issues. So we have not just that polling I mentioned, but dozens of essays, short accessible essays, about 4,000 words or so, on every aspect of these issues, whether it's how tariffs work or what the WTO is, or on fun things like food and globalization and sports. And we just actually released this week an essay on gaming and globalization, because believe it or not, the video game industry, which is massive, is very much global thanks to digital trade. And so we have tons of those essays. We have a fun interactive quiz and videos and the rest. So if you like this stuff or you don't agree with me and you want to learn more from other experts, go to cato.org, Defending Globalization.
Awesome. We're all big fans of Cato here. Thank you for all the work you're doing in defending free trade. Scott, I hope to have you back soon, and thanks again.
Thanks a lot.
Awesome. So for the sake of our audience, if you want to learn more about Students for Liberty, Students for Liberty is a global network of elite young leaders advancing liberty in all aspects of society. We have students on the ground in every inhabited continent pushing for these values that we discussed with Scott. The Local Coordinator Program is a program where you can get involved and be empowered to get the tools that you need to go out into the world and advance your career, whether that's in politics, business, or academia. We do our best to give young leaders the tools that they need to go make a powerful impact in their future. So if you want to learn more about that, go to join.studentsforliberty.org and apply for the Local Coordinator Program. We'd love to have you. But obviously, thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back again soon. Have a wonderful night.